You'll love what you hear. You'll love what you hear. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Untold Tales, one of our special episodes where we interview the authors. And today we have a real treat. We have Don Muchow, who is one of our top authors in the podcast besides Jeff Robinson, Dr. Robinson. And we are going to learn so much about him today. He's a dynamo athletically and writing wise. He's one of the most popular authors on the podcast. I mean, you guys are the ones who said that, not me. So thank you so much for tuning in today. And we are so excited. So we're going to get started. Budget maybe like half an hour for this episode, just like all the other episodes. And we're going to learn some really interesting stuff. So welcome, Dawn. Thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
Not bad. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So we're going to learn a lot about you today. And first of all, I want to congratulate you on just completing your, let's see, I have to read it, 50th Diversity 5 times Iron Quintuple Anvil Triathlon Challenge.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So for anyone in your listening audience who's not familiar with what that is, it's basically the equivalent of 5 Ironmans in a row. My rules, it's what they call a fat ass event, which is, I don't know where the term came from, but what it means is, I decide when I get to take a break, how long I take, that sort of thing. But it's just a personal challenge to see if you can do 12 miles of swimming, 560 miles of cycling, and 131 mile run. So that was the challenge.
I mean, when I watch you just run like just a little bit, 5 times an Ironman, like I literally will not run unless like dogs are chasing me. So like
you can't really outrun them. That's something I learned on the Transcon a couple of years ago.
Oh.
But carry cheese and doggy snacks and hope for the best.
Exactly. Well, so let's see. So you just finished that, but this isn't your first like super huge athletic event. Last year, you have a lot of media. Over 100 outlets covered you on your mouse to mouse run. Tell us a little bit about that. It was
that was a run.
Right?
That was a run from Disneyland in Anaheim, California, to Walt Disney World in Lake Buena Vista, Florida. 2,761 miles. In order to have it show up officially among the record keepers for transcontinental runs, they have sort of what they call the 2 wet feet rule. So I'd stick my toes in the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic to add an extra, I think it was 31 miles or something to that. I forget what the number was exactly, but it was 2748 total from coast to coast.
Oh my gosh. Driving that is like so much to me. I can't even imagine running it.
4 time zones and a buttload of miles.
Yeah.
And it was definitely a transformative experience that, and I know our topic today on the podcast is writing. It does sort of feed into, it becomes part of your repertoire of relevant experiences and can kind of inform some of the characters.
Absolutely.
In fact, one of the podcast episodes, The Seeds of Wisdom, was in part inspired by some of the lessons I learned along the way during the big run.
Absolutely. Yes. Jeff and I had interviews before together. He interviewed me. I interviewed him. That was episode 10 and 23. And we talked about that, about our backgrounds, our formal backgrounds, our corporate backgrounds, really informing our performances and our writing. So I'm sure that, on your run, you probably have a lot of time to be thinking about the meaning of life and different stories and things that are meaningful to you. So absolutely. It sounds like you had a lot of time to kind of be in your head a little bit.
Yeah, it's one of the most interesting challenges, and it informs my perspective as a writer as well, is that it teaches you to attend to the little details that make up the experience. It's very possible out there when you're zoning out and hundreds of miles of nothing, especially out in the Mojave Desert, to forget that the sun is coming up and things like that. And being forced to attend to the little details so you don't trip and rip your hand on a guardrail, ask me how I know, makes you more aware of what makes up a scene and what's going on in that moment outside of the dialogue or the exposition. And I feel like if I have benefited in any way from that experience from a creative perspective, it's opened my eyes to the value of attending to what's around you.
Absolutely. And especially with you have T1 diabetes, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The autoimmune variety.
Yes. So I would imagine that you would need to pay extra attention to the present moment to make sure that you're not starting to have a problem, and you can.
Yes, that's true. It was a challenge to a certain degree. That was mitigated somewhat by the fact that I had opportunities to train and to make myself familiar with what happens on a 40 to 50 mile running day, and what my blood sugar typically did during time like that. A lot was, interestingly enough, very dependent on the amount of stress I was feeling and not how many miles I put in. So I had some very casual, relaxed 45-mile days and some 28-mile days that were just brutal. And it was often the brutal 28-mile days that did me in, as opposed to running downhill from basically Carlsbad, New Mexico. It's pretty much downhill all the way across the country from that point. And it can take a toll when it's uphill both ways and the wind's blowing in your face and the sun's beating down on your back. You can let it get to your mind.
Well, isn't that a good, what do they call it? A metaphor for life?
Yeah, it is.
Everything. It is. For parenthood, for entrepreneurship, for corporate life, everything. I mean,
it certainly is.
You've got to get out of your head and into the present.
And yet I'm grateful for it. So, but I didn't want to sidetrack you. I definitely, it informs your perspective, though.
You're never sidetracking me. I'm sure our listeners love to hear what you have to say as a human person, just like them, instead of just, somebody who writes for a podcast. You're a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional being, and we love anything that you're thinking about. So.
As long as I don't let it slip what galaxy I'm from.
Especially for a sci-fi podcast, right?
Sure.
So I'm taking a look at the questions here, and we'll just dive right into it because there is a lot of questions about your stories and how you write. But first of all, I was very interested to know about your background. Like, where did you grow up? And are you an only child, or do you have siblings? What did your parents do for a living growing up? Things like that.
That's an interesting story. I'm a military brat, so I grew up everywhere. I was actually born in the South, but I have what a lot of people call NBC English. You move from one place to another and you sort of end up sounding like Tom Brokaw.
I never heard
except
that.
for the slurs. Anyway, I actually spent a good bit of my time growing up in England. I have 3 siblings that I grew up with. Another one that I met once I was an adult. And during my time growing up in England, my oldest sister was a classmate of Dan Peake and Jerry Buckley, who performed at a talent show and about a year later recorded a song called Horse with No Name.
Right.
So we got to see America before they were America. That's my brush with fame.
That's cool.
My dad was various things. He worked in the Navy as an intelligence analyst, basically. He told me he spent a lot of time listening to Russian transmissions when he was stationed in Alaska. they used to fly P-3C Orions out over the Kamchatka Peninsula. And he didn't talk a great deal about his work, but it was clearly very engrossing to him. And he had a lifelong interest in cryptography and things like that.
So let's cover another question. Did you go to college? How many times, if you did? And what degrees do you have, if you have any?
Oh, sure. I have a master's degree in computer science with specialization in robotics. So I've always been fascinated by robots. I got my degree in the late 1980s when the state of computing technology was not really enough to keep up with what I would call adaptive or natural robotics. My thesis advisor's primary thrust of research was in something he called natural robotics, which was the kind of stuff you see the Boston Dynamics robots doing these days.
Right.
His name was Peter Green, and I believe it was, I'm forgetting the name of the professor who created the pogo, Michael Rabert, who created the pogo stick robot. That was the foundation for what became Boston Dynamics. And I wanted to work with Michael Rabert at some point, and my life choices did not allow that. Chances are probably pretty good that had certain small things been different, I would be working at Boston Dynamics up to this day. But instead, I ended up working for a company right out of college that made a factory floor, separate motor NZ control type robots. And it kind of took the shine off that apple for many years. And I found myself moving more towards creative efforts, working in sales and marketing, that sort of thing, actually energized me in a way that nothing had since college.
Oh, cool.
I also have undergraduate degrees in mechanical engineering and psychology, which I thought would be useful in developing robots that could adapt and react with in the presence of humans, and not just sort of ignore them or act like they weren't there. And I grew up on $6 Million Man, and I thought all that stuff was pretty cool, and that's what I wanted to be when I grew up. And
well, you kind of are. I mean, running from coast to coast,
have to be a robot to do that, right?
You have to be a robot to do that.
Yeah,
for sure.
That kind of stuff is, as I've grown into the life that has unfolded in front of me, I find that nothing in my experience is wasted, and the college background has been useful and helpful. But I've since learned to tap other things that have happened in my life and try to round out some of my characters and my own experiences by listening to what's most relevant among the experiences that I've had.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I have found through the course of my life, because I'm not too far behind you as far as technology. I went to engineering school probably right after you, and robotics was still terrible. And I found it very fascinating as well. But, we were just not there, and it was difficult to make things work because everything was so big. You need huge breadboards to put, and put wires into each little hole, and it was very difficult to make something that was a reasonable size that could do reasonable things. So we ended up just making an electric, basketball hoop. That's the word I'm looking for.
Sure.
Basketball hoop. But it's interesting. I find it very interesting what you're talking about, because a lot of people think you need to either be left-brained or right-brained, that you're either a math person or you're a arts person. And you and Jeff clearly demonstrate that we are all sort of Renaissance people, because you have a very analytical mind, and that informs your creative writing. So
I think you have to be a little bit of both.
I think so.
I've had conversations, you mentioned Jeff. I've had some conversations with him. As your listeners may know, we've collaborated on a handful of items, and we're sort of the Scully and Mulder
Yeah.
of fiction. He'll often challenge me to keep rooted in the foundations of science, and I'll constantly challenge him about finding the mental or spiritual aspects of his characters.
Yes.
And I've enjoyed, I think I mentioned, I forget if it was The Seeds of Wisdom or The Beginnings of Wisdom. It was the podcast about the Buddhist monk traveling to the apex of a mountain and discovering an unfound cave.
I think it
And
was Seeds of
Seeds of
Wisdom.
Wisdom, I think it was.
I think it was.
And we wanted to make the protagonist someone that people could relate to. And writing from the perspective of someone who had, grown up with Americana, Godmother and Apple Pie, all that other stuff, but had been raised in a Vietnamese Buddhist family, I felt anchored the character in real life experience. The notion of the story was Jeff's. Often I work on the characters and unravel his plot sometimes. But you make a good point that the technical side of things must inform the reality and the structure of the story if you are writing anything close to hard SF. But that doesn't mean that it should be unrelatable or it should be basically like reading an engineering manual. Right. Readers and listeners still come for the drama. They relate to human characters more than anything. And I feel like that's an important aspect of things. Yeah. So most certainly, Jeff has to prop me up on the science sometimes. Despite having a scientific background, I find the personal drama a lot more attractive when I write.
I think that the drama is very important because it's the engine that drives our lives. It's what makes things interesting. It's what, it's what compels us to grow. And I know that for Jeff, he likes for listeners to walk away changed by the story. And I think that drama is what changes people when they listen to the story. They thought they were one place, and then at the end of the story, they're in a different place. And they're like, how did that happen?
I think that's the mark of good science fiction. Yeah. I don't know about other genres, but I always know I've seen a good SF film or read a good SF story if I put the book down or walk out of the theater and I think to myself, holy crap, we've been thinking about it all wrong. I want to see my mind expanded. Yes. I don't want science fiction to encourage me to feel comfortable with my surroundings. Right. And I know that there are some kinds, things like Star Wars are really just popcorn, but I want my mind bent.
Absolutely. And I think if you're not in growth, you're in decay. Even though you may not think that you're in decay, if you're not learning and pushing yourself and opening up, the world is moving around you, whether it's in science fiction or romance or whatever genre, it's moving. And if you're not moving with it, and if you're not adapting and changing and opening your mind to what's coming next, then you'll just become antiquated. And, a lot of people just want to stay relevant. They just want to be acknowledged. That's a basic human need, right? One of the questions I had for you is, are any of the stories in Untold Tales true stories or written from true story inspirations?
Yes. I'm not precisely sure which ones have made it into the hopper yet. But there was one, I would say horror adjacent story. I believe it was called Dark Epiphany that's coming. Ooh, that's coming.
That's coming. That's coming. It's going to be.
And that was based on 3 separate experiences on trains in Chicago. And it was amazing to me how pinched off from reality each of those experiences felt. Looking at them retrospectively, it felt to me like, did I really experience this, or did I wake up from a really intense dream and think that I did?
Yeah.
It was bordering on that sort of feeling. there was another story, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. I think it was Not the Only One.
Okay, that's coming up for you too, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I believe this is.
I've seen it.
I believe this is the story. I may have my titles confused, but this was one about a protagonist was a woman who was the psychiatrist for a space mission. And when the crew got in a debilitating situation, she was knocked unconscious. And in her mind, she was transported back to her therapy sessions with patients. And as people in the real world tried to talk to her, she saw them as her patients from 20 years ago. And those patients were actually based on some people at an inpatient psychiatric care facility that I worked at back in the late 1980s. And one of the things that I thought was interesting to deal with in that story was the character arcs specifically for one of the crew members who had a great distaste for alien invaders that had showed up on Earth, who had almost obsidian skin. And when the protagonist regressed to her therapy sessions, she was dealing with a patient who had an irrational fear of Black people. And I felt like this was something nobody ever talks about, is psychiatric and psychological roots to the fear of otherness.
Interesting.
And I wanted to deal directly with that in the story. And the real world experience of having to work with that patient every day for at least a couple of years fed into the story and created the character that ultimately turned out to be one of the heroes of the story. But I sort of felt like there was a story there that needed to be written. And my penchant is to write science fiction that talks about feelings and sort of the insurmountable psychological obstacles to moving forward in a world that doesn't seem to want to accept you. Yes. And I felt that was a very fruitful avenue to pursue, taking that real world character and turning them or her rather into a character in the story.
Yeah. I find it very interesting because I think that science fiction is a great place to explore concepts like, past life traumas, which I believe that, a lot of people may have had a bad experience. Maybe some people don't believe that we've been here multiple times, but sometimes I look at my kid and I'm like, she's been here a couple times.
Sure.
But, sometimes maybe some permutation of our beingness, our spiritualness went through a trauma with a certain kind of person or with a certain society, or maybe you got run over by a carriage in a former life. And now you have this strange fear of, huge tractors or, something like that. And you don't know why, because a tractor never did anything to you. And yet you look at one and your heart starts racing and you try to preserve yourself. Or I'm just giving a really silly example, but
sure. No, it's
maybe certain people have fears because something happened to their DNA, if you will, which is very sci-fi.
Sure.
They may be carrying that trauma with them that they just need to maybe take a look at,
You touch on a couple of interesting things, which I think would probably be a very fertile ground for some stories at some point. One is Jung's notion of race memory, sort of a DNA memory. You only have to look as far as the gazelle popping out of its mother's womb while a cheetah is approaching, and the gazelle knows to run from the moment of birth, knows to run.
Right.
To realize that some of our instructions are programmed in firmware and not software.
Right.
And where that takes our minds and our exploration of reality is the subject of our writing.
Yeah.
But I've also been inspired by one book in particular that touches on something you had mentioned. Stanley Robinson, who's the best-selling author of Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars trilogy, wrote a somewhat less critically acclaimed book called The Years of Rice and Salt. And it was about the joint experiences of a couple of good friends who found themselves meeting again in the Bardo, which for people who aren't familiar with Buddhist notions is sort of the similar to purgatory, sort of the more of a grand central station for the next launching of the next train of your life.
Nice.
And one of them found himself gradually coming to be at peace with existence and becoming more enlightened and working his way towards bodhisattvahood, while the other one found himself descending into a cycle towards existence as what the Buddhists call a hungry ghost, a thing that knows only need and pain.
Yes. And
I think there's a narrative there that, regardless of one's personal belief, has to inform this idea of, if we don't like where the train is going, do we get off, or do we go up and talk to the conductor,
or do we complain about it for the rest of our 12?
Yeah, do we sit there going, I don't like where this train is going, and then when we get to the station, act like we had some choice in it all.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think it's good to ask those questions and to explore those feelings and the speculations that they prompt.
Yeah.
Because that's where good stories come from.
Absolutely. And I think that my personal belief is that the world, a lot of people, I think you will notice in a lot of podcasts, and you noticed in a lot of videos, a lot of people are waking up to different kinds of truths. Sorry. Different kinds of truths that are not traditional. That's difficult to say.
Sure.
And it's not to say that any one tradition is correct or incorrect, but that many people are merging on to the same kinds of thoughts in different areas, which is we are eternal. We do have some kind of DNA memory, like you're talking about. And we do have some level of control, but not total control, because we find ourselves in these karmic cycles, if you will, of things that keep plaguing us, and they plagued our kids and they plagued our grandparents. And, our family always seems to have a problem with this specific thing. And, I'm breaking out of this for my generation, but then your kid starts acting up, So,
yeah, we do sort of stamp karma onto people fairly early.
Yeah. And
there's a philosopher of whom I'm somewhat fond by the name of Ken Wilber. He's a contemporary philosopher, wrote a book called The Eye of Mind, and he talks about how insight comes from three different sources, and only one of which is empirical data. And the other one is experiential data, and then finally the sort of insight that comes just from immersing yourself in a mental or spiritual state. You come to see some things as truths that you never could have reasoned your way towards, and you never would have learned from experience in a million years.
Right.
And speaking from my own perspective, I feel like it's important to realize that as the collective human existence, the same truth looks different in red, blue, or green light, so to speak. It depends on whether you shine experience on it, sort of psychological, mental, and spiritual insight, or if you try and deconstruct something into its component truths, only to find out that something escaped when you were taking the cat apart. Um,
Interesting. Does that apply to like you forgot to set the timer on your egg and then you kind of know when it's done? Does that is that
I
kind of
cook like
thing?
that, so I'm probably
It's like
probably not a good person to tap on that. But yeah, something gets programmed mentally or in the back of your mind that sort of works, for lack of a better metaphor, works in your right brain, and the conclusions that we arrive at pop out of our mouths unbidden at just the time they need to happen. And
Exactly. I find that all the time. It's so true.
I think it's an important thing to recognize, especially as a writer, to realize that one of the things, I won't call it a pet peeve because I've learned to recognize it for what it is and have some compassion for it. But there are some people whose characters are cardboard cutouts, and as an author, this disconcerts me somewhat to see a character whose behaviors and motivations I don't understand or at least empathize with. I'm not necessarily sort of a person who roots for the anti-hero or anything like that, but I would like to know why the bad guy is a bad guy. How did he get to be a bad guy? And I always look for that in stories. Tell me why this character is believable. Tell me why this plot happened. It didn't just happen all by itself.
Right.
And one of the things I explore in a novel that I have been working on and hope someday to excerpt into Untold Tales and Pieces is the story about what happens when Earth, in its sort of postmodern, jaded state of mind, finally encounters aliens. And we're ready for that at one point. Everybody has been raised in the culture of, oh, we're not alone, and there's creatures out there, and they have spaceships and all that stuff. We're ready for that as a society. We're prepared. No one's going to have a fit. But certain things are predictable. And the beginning of the movie Arrival, you see the stock market tanking when aliens show up, just because they show up.
Yeah.
That strikes me as quite realistic. Introducing uncertainty into markets and world politics predictably causes those kinds of effects. And likewise in the novel The Trade, which I'm working on, one of our protagonists, a guy named Eric Henderson, is nearing retirement when he finds it his job to let higher ups in the US intelligence agencies know that we are not alone. And the real drama is not about the aliens. It's about the guy trying to avoid basically having a turd dropped on the dinner table of his career.
Right.
And having it sit there steaming while he tries to retire.
Well, that's worse than an elephant, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That is nasty on the dinner table anyway.
Yeah. It's just the one thing you don't want to have happen as you're getting close to the end of your career is to have some god-awful blow up. And I actually found it more interesting to explore the interior workings of that character's mind than to try and figure out which side would shoot first. And I was inspired by a story, nonfiction story, Admiral Fitzgerald, who was the captain of the HMS Beagle that ferried Charles Darwin to South America, Tierra del Fuego, Galapagos Islands, that whole area. They dropped off 3 of their crew and took 3 Fuegians back to Victorian England. And in about 25 years, Fuegian culture had disappeared. Nobody got sick. Nobody got a virus. Nobody shot anybody. The Fuegians just gave up. And to me, I found that an incredibly fascinating insight into what goes on in the human mind when it's faced with challenges that are just way too tall to take in one glance. And from a writing perspective, aliens schmalians, but tell me something special that goes on when we meet aliens, and you got me hooked on a story.
Yeah.
I think that's why I liked Arrival so much. it was a different telling of a different narrative from a very different perspective. And it was a fresh take on an overworn trope.
Absolutely. And I have been listening this whole time of the listeners to all these books you've been dropping. So if anybody is out there listening and you're thinking, oh my goodness, he just mentioned all these books, I'm going to make a list of all the books that are mentioned in this episode and put them in the show notes so that you can go and check out these writings. I think it's very important that we read banned books, that we read all kinds of books, because when you don't know history and you don't know writings and you don't know creative works, I think it really it hurts your growth as a human being, as a spiritual being. And I think the more that you know, the better for you. So that was
well, and I know you probably wouldn't plug it yourself, but I've had the opportunity to listen to most of the podcasts on Untold Tales, and it's precisely the kind of mind-expanding fiction that a lifelong fan of mind benders and hard SF, like myself, tends to enjoy. So if you're not much in the market for shoot 'em ups, and you want things that are more focused on what goes on in the minds of your characters, please do give a listen. It's definitely worth the time.
Absolutely. That's part of the reason why I enjoy narrating it so much, is because I really enjoy the intelligent stories, if you will, stories that are not.
Plus, I made you say words in Farsi.
Yeah. Plus, you made me say words in Farsi. Guys, I literally have to hire a dialect coach for some of these authors because they give me some crazy accents, and I have to ask for pronunciation guides for half the words that they make me say. So every time we have an episode, at least a couple weeks went into just figuring out what the heck is he trying to, what is this? So yeah, a lot of work and a lot of love goes into the enjoyment and the process of this podcast. So hopefully you feel that, hopefully you hear that, and hopefully you love what you hear. But yeah, so I think we're rounding out at the end of the interview here. I've really enjoyed it. If anyone is listening and you have more questions, there are some cool things coming up, i.e. we are launching a new website, which you will be able to make comments on stories and contact us and ask us questions and even ask us for things that you want to hear, which is even more special. And as a bonus, in the new year, we are going to be offering audio bundles of specific works by specific authors. So you won't have to go and scroll through the podcast anymore for all of Dawn's awesome stories. You'll be able to purchase them for a very, very low price. And when you purchase these things, you'll be supporting the authors, people like Dawn and myself who put a lot of work into this. And you'll be able to keep that for yourself so that it's super convenient whenever you're driving around and you want to listen to something cool. So we hope you'll check that out in the new year whenever we announce it, and we hope you'll subscribe and like and all that good stuff. So, Dawn, I think we're rounding out at the end of this interview. Is there anything that you had hoped to talk to our listening audience or watching audience? This will be on YouTube as well, for the coming years and what's up next for you?
Well, I would say to the listeners, do keep bending your mind out of shape. You'll never know what you're capable of thinking if you don't try. And this is a good place to do that. As far as crazy adventures and things, I'd like to swim around Key West next June. So I'll be spending a lot of time at the pool since the water's dropped below 59 degrees out at the lake. And that's about 5 degrees too cold for me to even go out in a rubber suit.
I'm still waiting for the North Pole to the South Pole extravaganza.
Yeah, I don't know. I read an article about a couple of ladies who were endeavoring to do something like that.
Oh my gosh!
And it sounded to me like it was a multi-year project.
For sure.
Because it's probably on the order of 15,000 miles.
Oh my God.
And I don't know. Once I become a rich best-selling author, maybe I'll do that. But
And
in
you
the
guys
mean,
can help.
yeah,
Help Don
please
reach his
contribute.
goals.
Buy more stories.
Buy more stories. Buy more
Yeah.
books. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on here. Everybody listening and watching, we hope that you loved what you heard. We hope that you learned a lot. And thank you so much for spending your time with us. We appreciate our listeners, fans, and patrons. And we always hope that you love what you hear. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Melissa. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I used to do a really good Kermit the Frog imitation.
Kermit the Frog?
Exactly. It's deep down in the throat type
Kermit
vocal
the
cords.
Frog. It's right here. Right here.
That's
Frog.
about as accurate as I could
Yeah, that's good.
describe.
That's right. That's great.
You'll love what you hear. You'll love what you hear.